The coffin was barely in the ground when Grace Pritchard first raised her chin at the man who dared to offer her comfort, and told him words that would haunt them both for months to come. It was the autumn of 1878, in the small cattle town of Cedar Hollow, Wyoming Territory, where the wind carried the scent of dust and distant rain, and the cemetery on the hill overlooked a valley still green from the last of the summer rains. Grace stood at the edge of a fresh grave, her black mourning dress pressed against her by the wind, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild strands that she did not bother to tame. Beside her stood the town preacher, Reverend Whitfield, his Bible closed now, the final words spoken over the pine box that held her husband, Thomas Pritchard, dead 3 days past from a fever that had swept through half the ranch hands in the valley. She had buried a husband. She had buried in the same terrible week the infant daughter they had been expecting, lost before her first breath, taken by the same sickness that had weakened Grace's body just enough to steal the child from her womb. 2 graves side by side, one large and one heartbreakingly small, marked only with wooden crosses that the local carpenter had made in haste. The mourners had mostly departed by the time Abel Malone approached, his hat in his hands, his boots quiet on the gravel path that wound through the cemetery. He was a rancher, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a Wyoming sky before a storm, gray-blue and full of something Grace did not yet recognize as kinship. He had lost his own wife, Sarah, 2 years before to a similar fever, and his young son along with her, though the boy had lived 3 days after his mother before the sickness took him too. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew Abel Malone's story. It was why the women of the town had sent him to speak with Grace, thinking that a man who had walked through the same fire might offer her some solace that their own words of sympathy could not. "Mrs. Pritchard," Abel said, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man used to calming spooked cattle and frightened men alike. "I am sorry for your loss, more sorry than I know how to say." Grace turned to him, her eyes rimmed red but dry now, the tears having been spent hours before in the privacy of her small house. She looked at him, this stranger who had lost his own wife and child, and something bitter rose up in her chest, something she could not stop from spilling out. "You'll never understand loss like mine," she told him, her voice cracking despite her effort to keep it steady. "Thomas was my whole world, and that baby she would have been." Her voice broke entirely, and she turned away from him, ashamed of her own cruelty even as she said it, knowing somewhere in the back of her mind that this man standing before her had suffered nearly the same fate. Abel did not flinch. He did not argue with her, though every word she spoke described almost exactly what he had lived through himself. He simply stood there, his hat still in his hands, and let her grief wash over him like a wave he had already weathered once before. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "I suppose you're right. Nobody can understand another person's loss exactly. Every grief is its own animal." He paused, watching her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "But I lost my wife Sarah 2 years back to the same kind of fever near enough. And I lost my boy Daniel 3 days after her. He was not but 2 years old." He said this plainly, without seeking pity, simply stating a fact of his life that he carried with him always, the way a man carries the weight of his own bones. Grace's head turned slowly, and she looked at him again, this time seeing not just a stranger offering hollow comfort, but a man whose eyes held the same shadow that she now felt behind her own. Shame flooded through her, hot and sudden. "I did not know," she whispered. "Mr. Malone, I am sorry. I should not have said such a thing to you of all people." "You have nothing to apologize for," Abel said. "Grief does not think before it speaks. I know that better than most." He glanced toward the 2 graves, the large one and the small one beside it, and something in his weathered face softened further, a memory rising unbidden. "I know what it is to bury a wife and a child in the same week. I know what it is to walk back into a house that still smells like her, and find her hairbrush still sitting on the dresser, and not have the strength to move it." Grace's breath caught and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, not from renewed grief alone, but from the shock of being understood so completely by a man she had just accused of ignorance. "How did you go on?" she asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. "How did you keep breathing after?" "I am not entirely certain I have," Abel admitted, a faint, sad smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Most days I simply do what needs doing. The cattle need feeding, the fences need mending, and somehow the sun keeps rising whether we ask it to or not." He looked at her, his gray-blue eyes steady and kind. "But I will tell you this, Mrs. Pritchard. It does get easier to carry, even if it never gets lighter. You find ways to set it down for a spell here and there, even if you must pick it back up again." Grace wiped at her eyes with the back of her gloved hand, feeling suddenly and terribly exposed, standing in the cemetery with a man she barely knew, speaking of things she had shared with no one, not even her own mother, who lived 3 days' ride away in Laramie, and had not yet been able to reach Cedar Hollow for the funeral. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice small, "for not holding my words against me." "There is nothing to hold," Abel said simply. "Grief is grief, and it does not follow manners. If you should ever need someone who understands, even a little, my ranch is not far. Malone spread west of town near Cottonwood Creek. Anyone can point the way." He put his hat back on then, nodded to her once, and walked away down the gravel path, leaving Grace standing alone once more between the two graves, though she found that the ache in her chest had shifted somehow, had made room for something she could not yet name. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Grace's life. She was 26 years old, and she had come to Cedar Hollow 3 years before as a new bride, following Thomas Pritchard west from Ohio after a whirlwind courtship that had swept her off her feet with promises of a new life, a ranch of their own, a family to raise beneath the wide Wyoming sky. Thomas had been a good man, steady and hardworking, if not given to grand romantic gestures, and Grace had loved him in the quiet way that comes from building a life together, brick by brick, season by season. Now the ranch house felt impossibly large and impossibly empty. Thomas had left behind a modest spread of land, a small herd of cattle that Grace knew little about managing, and debts that she had not known existed until the bank in Cedar Hollow sent a polite but firm letter reminding her that the note on the property would come due in the spring, and that without a man to work the land, the bank could not extend further credit. Grace sat at her kitchen table with that letter in her hands for the better part of an hour, the late autumn light slanting gold through the window, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. She had no family in the territory save her mother, too far and too frail to be of practical help. She had no skills beyond housekeeping and a bit of schooling that had taught her to read and write and do sums, none of which seemed likely to save a cattle ranch from foreclosure. It was Widow Henley, her nearest neighbor, a sharp-tongued but kind-hearted woman in her 50s who had buried 2 husbands of her own, who first suggested that Grace speak with Abel Malone about hiring on some of his hands to help work the Pritchard spread until Grace could find her feet. "He is a decent man," Widow Henley said, sitting across from Grace at that same kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming her hands. "Lost his wife Sarah same as you lost your Thomas, near enough. And that boy of theirs, sweet as summer, gone before he had a chance to grow. Abel has not courted a single woman since, though plenty have tried to catch his eye. He keeps to himself mostly, works that ranch of his like it is the only thing keeping him upright." "I could not ask a stranger for such help," Grace said, though even as she spoke the words, she remembered the cemetery, the way Abel Malone had understood her grief without needing it explained, the way his gray-blue eyes had held no judgment for her cruel words. "He is not so much a stranger as you think," Widow Henley said with a knowing look. "And pride will not pay your note come spring, Grace Pritchard. Sometimes a woman must swallow her pride to keep her home." It took Grace another 2 weeks to work up the courage to ride out to the Malone spread, 2 weeks in which she tried and failed to manage the small herd of cattle Thomas had left behind, nearly losing 3 head to a ravine when she attempted to move them alone, and injuring her wrist badly enough that she wore a wrap for a week afterward. It was that injury, more than anything, that finally convinced her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She rode out to the Malone ranch on a cold morning in early November, the frost still silvering the grass, her breath visible in the air before her. The ranch house came into view as she crested a small hill, a sturdy structure of timber and stone, smoke curling from its chimney, cattle grazing in the pastures beyond. It was, she noted with a small pang, a well-run operation, everything in its place, fences mended, gates oiled and swinging freely. Abel Malone was in the yard when she arrived, mending a section of fence with a young hired hand who could not have been more than 19 years old. He looked up at the sound of her horse's hooves, and Grace saw something flicker across his face, surprise perhaps, or something else she could not name. "Mrs. Pritchard," he said, straightening and setting aside his tools. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Mr. Malone," Grace said, dismounting with more grace than she felt, her injured wrist protesting the movement. "I have come to ask for your help, though I confess I am not entirely certain how to ask for it properly." Abel's gaze dropped briefly to her wrapped wrist and his brow furrowed with concern. "What happened?" "I tried to move cattle on my own," Grace admitted, a flush of embarrassment warming her cheeks despite the cold. "It did not go well." To her surprise, Abel did not laugh at her, nor did he offer the kind of condescending sympathy she had half expected. Instead, he nodded seriously, as though she had told him something entirely reasonable rather than foolish. "Cattle work is not something a person learns overnight," he said. "Took me years to get any good at it, and I grew up doing it alongside my father. What is it you need, Mrs. Pritchard?" Grace took a breath, steadying herself. "The bank says my note comes due in spring, and without help managing the ranch, I fear I will lose it entirely. I have some savings, not much, but enough to pay for a few hands to help me through the winter, if you might spare any, or know of any looking for work." Abel considered this for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where the mountains stood dark and jagged against the pale sky. "I could spare a hand or two," he said finally. "Though I think, if you will permit me to say so, you might do better with someone who can teach you the running of it yourself, rather than simply doing it for you. A ranch needs an owner who understands it, or it will always be vulnerable. And who would teach me such things?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer and felt her pulse quicken at the thought. "I could," Abel said simply, "if you were willing to learn. I ride pasture spread most mornings on my way to check the north pastures. It would be no trouble to stop by, show you what needs doing, until you have the hang of it." It was, Grace thought, a remarkably generous offer for a man who owed her nothing, who she had wounded with careless words in the cemetery not 2 months before. She studied his face, searching for some hidden motive, some expectation of payment beyond what she could offer, but found only the same quiet steadiness she had sensed in him before. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, unable to keep the question from her lips. Abel's expression grew distant for a moment, as though he were looking at something far away, something only he could see. "Because I know what it is to face a mountain of grief and a mountain of work all at once, and to have no one beside you to help carry either," he said. "Sarah's family was back east, same as yours, I imagine. When she died, I had this ranch and no notion how I would keep it running while my whole world was falling apart. A neighbor helped me then, old man Cooper, God rest him. Showed me things my own father had died before teaching me proper. I suppose I am simply returning a kindness that was shown to me." Grace felt something tighten in her throat, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something warmer that she did not yet have a name for. "Thank you, Mr. Malone," she said softly. "I do not know how I will repay such kindness." "You need not repay it," Abel said. "Just learn well and keep your ranch standing. That will be repayment enough." And so began the strange and slowly warming friendship between Grace Pritchard and Abel Malone, built not on stolen glances or romantic declarations, but on early mornings spent learning the proper way to check a cow for illness, on afternoons spent mending fences side by side, while the autumn wind turned colder and the first snow began to dust the mountain peaks. Abel taught her patiently, never once making her feel foolish for her lack of knowledge, and Grace found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that surprised her, given how recently she had buried her husband. She told herself it was simply gratitude, simply the comfort of having someone who understood her grief without needing explanation. But as the weeks passed into December, and the two of them found themselves sharing coffee in her kitchen after the morning's work was done, talking not just of cattle and fences, but of their pasts, their losses, their hopes for the future, Grace began to suspect that what she felt for Abel Malone was growing into something far more complicated than gratitude. One particularly cold morning in mid-December, as frost coated the windows of Grace's small kitchen and the fire crackled in the hearth, Abel arrived earlier than usual, his breath visible in the frigid air, his cheeks reddened from the cold ride over. "I have something for you," he said, somewhat awkwardly as he stepped inside and stamped the snow from his boots. He held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "It is not much. Just a good pair of gloves, proper ones for working with cattle. I noticed yours were near worn through." Grace took the bundle, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment longer than necessary, and unwrapped it to find a sturdy pair of leather gloves, well-made and clearly not cheap. "Abel," she said, using his first name for the first time, the word feeling strange and new on her tongue, "this is too generous a gift." "It is practical," Abel said, though a faint color had risen in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "Cannot have you injuring that wrist again." "Thank you," Grace said, and found herself smiling, a real smile, the first genuine smile she had managed since Thomas's death. "Truly, Abel, thank you." He returned her smile, and for a moment, standing there in her small kitchen with the fire crackling and the snow falling softly outside the window, something passed between them that was unmistakably more than friendship, though neither of them spoke of it, both too aware of the respectability that grief demanded, the mourning period that society expected a widow to observe. It was Widow Henley, sharp-eyed as ever, who first voiced what both Grace and Abel had been avoiding acknowledging. "That man is sweet on you," she told Grace bluntly one afternoon in late December, as the two women sat together mending quilts by the fire. "Anyone with eyes can see it. And you are sweet on him too, though you would rather eat glass than admit it." "Thomas has not been gone 4 months," Grace said, though there was little conviction in her protest. "Thomas is gone, and grieving him does not mean you cannot find comfort with another," Widow Henley said, not unkindly. "I buried 2 husbands, Grace. I know something of grief, and I know something of love finding its way back into a heart that thought it was closed forever. There is no shame in it, so long as you give proper respect to the memory of the one you lost." Grace said nothing to this, but she thought of it often in the days that followed, thought of Abel Malone's steady hands and steadier eyes, of the way he had understood her grief in the cemetery without needing it explained, of the growing warmth she felt whenever he walked through her door. The winter deepened, bringing with it a series of harsh storms that tested both ranches and the resolve of everyone in Cedar Hollow. It was during one such storm, in late January of 1879, that the true depth of Abel Malone's character revealed itself to Grace in a way that changed everything between them. A blizzard swept through the valley without warning, dropping temperatures to dangerous lows and burying the roads in snow so deep that travel became nearly impossible. Grace had gone out that morning to check on her small herd, wanting to ensure they had shelter from the coming storm, but the blizzard descended faster than anyone had predicted, and she found herself lost in a whiteout so complete that she could not see more than a few feet in any direction. Panic set in quickly. She had heard stories of travelers freezing to death mere yards from their own front doors, disoriented by the blinding snow, and she felt that same disorientation now, her sense of direction utterly scrambled, the cold beginning to seep through her coat and into her bones. She called out, though she knew no one was likely to hear her over the howling wind, and stumbled forward, praying she was moving toward home and not further into the wilderness. It was Abel who found her, nearly an hour later, having ridden out into the storm himself the moment he realized she had not returned to her house, some instinct or perhaps simply his knowledge of ranch work telling him she had gone out to check her cattle before the storm hit. He found her half frozen, disoriented, stumbling in circles less than a quarter mile from her own house, so close and yet so hopelessly lost. "Grace!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind, and when she turned toward the sound he was there, pulling her into his arms, wrapping his own coat around her shivering frame. "I have got you. You are safe now." She clung to him, tears freezing on her cheeks, overwhelmed with relief and cold and something else, something that felt suspiciously like the recognition that this man's arms felt like safety in a way she had not experienced since long before Thomas's death, perhaps not even then. He got her onto his horse, wrapped in his own coat, and led the animal carefully through the blinding snow, navigating by instinct and memory alone, until the shape of her house finally emerged from the white chaos. Inside, he built up the fire with hands that shook slightly from the cold, and wrapped her in every blanket he could find, rubbing warmth back into her hands and feet with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "You could have died out there," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he was clearly trying to control. "I do not know what I would have done if—" He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence, and Grace saw in his eyes a fear that went far beyond simple concern for a neighbor. "I am here," Grace said softly, "because of you. I could not lose another," Abel began, then stopped again, his jaw tightening as though he had said more than he intended. "Another what?" Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though she thought she already knew, could feel the answer humming in the air between them like something alive. Abel looked at her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "Another person I have come to care for. Grace, I know it has not been long since you lost Thomas, and I do not wish to dishonor his memory or your grief. But these past months, working alongside you, coming to know you, I have found myself caring for you in a way I did not think myself capable of feeling again, not after Sarah." Grace's breath caught, her heart pounding not from the cold now but from something entirely different. "Abel," she said softly, "I have felt it too. I have tried to tell myself it was simply gratitude, simply the comfort of shared grief, but it is more than that, is it not?" "I believe it is," Abel said, reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Though I would understand if you needed more time if this feels too soon." Grace considered this, considered the weight of Thomas's memory, the small grave beside his that held the daughter she had never met, the months of grief that had shaped her into someone new, someone who understood loss in a way she never had before. But she also considered the months of Abel's quiet kindness, his patient teaching, his understanding that had never once made her feel judged for her grief or her mistakes. "I do not think I need more time," she said finally. "I think I have spent these months healing alongside you, without even realizing that was what was happening. Thomas would want me to be happy, Abel. I believe that with my whole heart, and I think I am happier now, in this moment, than I have been since long before he died." It was Abel who closed the distance between them then, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was soft and searching at first, then deepening as Grace responded with an eagerness that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both breathless, Abel's forehead rested against hers, his hand still cupping her face with a tenderness that made her chest ache with something that felt remarkably like joy. "I have not felt this in a long time," he murmured. "This particular kind of happiness. I had thought it died with Sarah." "And I had thought it died with Thomas," Grace replied. "Perhaps we were both wrong." The blizzard raged outside for 2 more days, trapping Abel at Grace's ranch, though neither of them minded the enforced closeness, spending the hours talking, sharing stories of their late spouses without jealousy or discomfort. each understanding intuitively that loving someone new did not require forgetting or diminishing what had come before. Abel told her more about Sarah, about her laugh, about the way she used to sing while she worked, about their son Daniel's first steps taken just weeks before the fever took him. Grace told him about Thomas, about his quiet steadiness, about the daughter she had never held but had already loved with her whole heart. "I used to think," Grace admitted on the second night of the storm as they sat together by the fire, "that no one could understand the particular shape of my grief. That is why I said what I did to you in the cemetery. I thought myself alone in a way no one else could touch." "And now?" Abel asked. "Now I know that grief, while it may feel singular to the one experiencing it, does not mean we cannot recognize its shape in another. You understood mine completely, Abel, even when I refused to believe you could." "I understood it because I lived a version of it myself," Abel said. "But I think, perhaps, that is not the only reason I understood you. I think some part of me recognized something in you from that very first day in the cemetery, something beyond shared grief. I do not entirely understand it myself, but I know that when I look at you, I feel something I had thought myself incapable of feeling again." When the storm finally cleared, revealing a world transformed into gleaming white silence, Abel returned to his own ranch, though not before promising to return the following day, and the day after that, and every day he could manage, weather and work permitting. Word spread quickly through Cedar Hollow, as word always did in small towns, that the widow Pritchard and the widower Malone had found comfort in each other's company. Some in town clucked their tongues at the perceived haste of such a match, given how recently both had lost their spouses, but many more, including Reverend Whitfield himself, saw only the natural progression of two wounded souls finding solace in shared understanding. "Grief does not follow a calendar," Reverend Whitfield told Grace when she came to him, seeking some kind of blessing or permission for the feelings growing within her. "The Lord does not measure love by months passed since a loss, but by the sincerity of the heart. If you have found genuine comfort and affection with Abel Malone, and if it does not diminish the memory of Thomas, then I see no sin in allowing yourself this happiness." Grace took his words to heart, and as winter began to loosen its grip on the valley, giving way to the first tentative signs of spring, her courtship with Abel Malone bloomed alongside the earliest wildflowers pushing up through the melting snow. He courted her properly, bringing small gifts, escorting her to church services, sharing meals with her that they cooked together in her small kitchen, laughing more freely than either had in years. There were difficult moments, too, moments when grief resurfaced unexpectedly, threatening to overwhelm the fragile happiness they were building together. Grace had one particularly hard day in early March, the anniversary of her wedding to Thomas falling just as the spring thaw began, memories of that happy day 3 years before crashing over her with unexpected force as she stood in her kitchen, staring at a wedding photograph she kept on the mantel. Abel found her there, tears streaming down her face, and rather than trying to distract her from her grief or rush her through it, he simply sat with her, held her hand, and let her speak of Thomas as long as she needed, sharing memories both happy and painful without judgment. "I am not trying to replace him," Abel said quietly when her tears had finally slowed. "I know I never could, nor would I want to. Thomas gave you 3 years of marriage, of building a life together. That deserves to be honored, not erased." "I know that," Grace said, wiping her eyes, "and I love you more for understanding it so completely. Sarah is a part of you too, Abel, and I would never ask you to forget her or Daniel. We are not starting fresh, either of us. We are simply continuing, carrying our past with us into whatever future we might build together." It was this mutual understanding, this refusal to demand that the other forget their previous loves in order to embrace a new one, that formed the true foundation of what grew between Grace Pritchard and Abel Malone. They did not fall in love despite their grief, but rather through it, each finding in the other someone who could hold space for both mourning and joy simultaneously, without asking either to diminish the other. By April, with the valley fully green again and the cattle beginning to fatten on new spring grass, Abel proposed to Grace on the very hill where they had first met, though not at the cemetery itself, but at a spot nearby where wildflowers now bloomed in profusion, purple and yellow and white against the green grass. "I know it may seem hasty to some," Abel said, kneeling before her with a small ring that had belonged to his own mother, "but I have learned, through loss, that time is not something to be wasted on propriety when the heart already knows what it wants. Grace Pritchard, I love you. I love your strength, your kindness, your willingness to learn and grow even in the midst of grief. I would be honored beyond measure if you would consent to be my wife." Grace, tears of joy rather than grief now streaming down her face, did not hesitate in her answer. "Yes, Abel Malone. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you too, more than I thought myself capable of loving again." They were married in June of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Cedar Hollow Church, with Reverend Whitfield presiding and most of the town in attendance, including Widow Henley, who cried openly through the entire ceremony and later claimed credit for having predicted the match from the very beginning. Grace wore a simple blue dress rather than white, a small acknowledgement of the fact that this was not her first marriage, but her joy was no less complete for that distinction. The combined Pritchard and Malone ranches were merged under Abel's careful management, with Grace taking an increasingly active role in the operation as her knowledge and confidence grew. She proved to have a natural talent for the business side of ranching, keeping meticulous records and negotiating better prices for their cattle than Abel had managed on his own, while Abel's expertise in the physical work of the ranch ensured their combined operation thrived where either might have struggled alone. Their first child together, a son they named Thomas Daniel Malone, honoring both of their lost loved ones in his very name, was born in the spring of 1880, nearly exactly 1 year after their wedding. Grace's labor was long but ultimately without complication, and when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, Grace wept with a joy so profound it nearly matched her earlier grief in intensity, though this time the tears were entirely of happiness. Abel, who had been pacing anxiously outside throughout the labor, memories of Sarah's difficult and ultimately fatal childbirth surely weighing on his mind despite his efforts to remain calm, nearly collapsed with relief when told that both mother and child were healthy and strong. He held his son for the first time with hands that trembled, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Abel whispered, gazing down at the tiny face of his son. "Absolutely perfect." "He looks like you," Grace said from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness, something in the set of his brow already. "I see you in him too," Abel replied. "In his eyes, I think, though it is hard to tell so soon." They raised young Thomas Daniel with the same understanding and openness that had characterized their own courtship, never hiding from him the fact that he had 2 half-siblings who had not lived to see the world, a half-sister who would have been his older sibling had she survived, and a half-brother, Daniel, who had lived just long enough to leave an impression on his father's heart before the fever took him too. Rather than treating these losses as shameful secrets, Grace and Abel spoke of them openly, visiting the small graves on the hill regularly, tending the wildflowers that grew there, teaching young Thomas Daniel from an early age that love and loss often walked hand in hand, and that acknowledging grief did not diminish present happiness. 2 years after Thomas Daniel's birth, Grace gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Sarah Grace Malone, honoring Abel's first wife just as they had honored Grace's memories in their son's name. The birth of their daughter brought its own complicated emotions, Abel admitting to Grace one evening as they watched their 2 children playing together in the yard that he had feared, somewhat irrationally, that naming a daughter after Sarah might somehow curse the child with the same fate that had claimed his first wife. "That fear is understandable," Grace said, taking his hand. "But look at her, Abel. Look at how strong she is, how healthy. She carries Sarah's name, but she carries her own life, her own destiny. I believe Sarah would be honored, not troubled, to know her memory lives on in such a beautiful, healthy child. You are remarkably wise, for someone who once told me I could never understand your loss, Abel said with a gentle smile, referencing that first difficult meeting in the cemetery all those years before. I was wrong to say that, Grace replied, as she had said many times over the years, though the words never lost their significance to either of them. You understood it more completely than anyone else could have. It was that understanding that saved me, Abel, in more ways than simply helping me keep the ranch running. You saved my heart from closing forever. You saved mine as well, Abel said. I do not know that I would have opened myself to love again if not for you. I had resigned myself to a life of quiet solitude, punctuated only by the demands of ranch work. You gave me a reason to hope again, to believe that happiness was still possible. Their ranch continued to prosper through the 1880s, weathering the occasional harsh winter and the ever-present challenges of frontier life, including a particularly difficult drought in 1886 that tested the resilience of every rancher in the valley. But Grace and Abel faced these challenges together, their partnership having grown stronger with each passing year, their understanding of each other deepening as they navigated both the practical demands of ranch life and the ongoing work of honoring their past losses while building their shared future. The town of Cedar Hollow itself grew during these years as well, transforming from a small cattle town into a more established community, complete with a proper schoolhouse where young Thomas Daniel and Sarah Grace, along with their younger siblings who would follow in the coming years, received their education. A general store expanded its offerings, a second church was built to accommodate the growing congregation, and the railroad finally extended a spur line close enough to the valley that cattle could be shipped more efficiently to markets in the east, bringing new prosperity to ranchers throughout the region, including the combined Pritchard Malone spread that Grace and Abel had built together. By 1885, Grace and Abel had welcomed a third child, a son they named William Abel Malone, born on a crisp autumn morning with none of the complications that had marked their previous experiences with childbirth and loss. William grew into a rambunctious and curious boy, always following his older siblings around the ranch, eager to learn everything Abel could teach him about cattle and horses and the running of their prosperous spread. It was during this period of relative peace and prosperity that Grace finally felt secure enough in her happiness to write a long letter to her mother in Laramie, detailing not just the practical successes of their ranch, but the deep emotional healing she had experienced through her marriage to Abel. Her mother, now quite elderly and unable to travel easily, wrote back with tears evident in her careful penmanship, expressing joy that her daughter had found such profound happiness after such devastating loss, and expressing gratitude to a man she had never met but whose character she had come to admire through Grace's letters over the years. "I only wish your father had lived to see this," her mother wrote, referencing Grace's own father who had passed some years before Thomas's death. "He would have approved heartily of a man who understands loss so deeply, and who has helped you build such a beautiful life despite the tragedies that preceded it." Grace read this letter aloud to Abel one evening after the children had been put to bed and found herself crying again, though these tears, like so many she had shed in recent years, were tears of gratitude rather than grief. "I never imagined," she said, "when I stood in that cemetery, cursing you for daring to suggest you understood my pain, that we would end up here, married with 3 beautiful children, running a successful ranch together. It seems almost impossible when I look back on it." "Grief has a way of blinding us to future possibilities," Abel said, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed so much of their shared history. "I felt the same way after Sarah died. I could not imagine feeling joy again, could not picture a future that held anything but empty routine and quiet sorrow. You changed that for me, Grace. You gave me a reason to believe in happiness again." "We changed it for each other," Grace corrected gently. "Neither of us could have healed alone. It took both of our understanding, both of our willingness to be vulnerable with each other to build what we have now." As the decade drew toward its close, tragedy touched their lives once more, though this time it was a loss they faced together rather than separately. Abel's mother, who had come to live with them on the ranch 2 years prior after the death of Abel's father, passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1888, having lived long enough to see her son find happiness again and to know her grandchildren, a comfort that eased the grief of her passing considerably. This loss, while painful, was different from the losses that had originally brought Grace and Abel together. It was the natural passing of an elderly woman who had lived a full life, surrounded by family who loved her, rather than the sudden, devastating loss of a spouse or child taken too soon. Grace and Abel grieved together, supporting each other through the funeral arrangements and the difficult weeks that followed, their partnership proving its resilience once again in the face of sorrow. "It is different grieving with someone beside you," Grace observed one evening as they sat together after the funeral, the children finally asleep after a long, emotional day. "When Thomas died, I felt so entirely alone, even surrounded by well-meaning neighbors and the Reverend's kind words. But grieving your mother's passing with you beside me, sharing the weight of it, feels entirely different. That is perhaps the greatest gift we have given each other," Abel said. "Not just companionship in joy, but companionship in sorrow as well. We need not carry grief alone anymore, either of us." Their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose Malone, was born in the summer of 1890, completing their family in a way that felt both natural and deeply blessed given the tragedies that had preceded this joy. By this time, Grace was 38 years old, and while the pregnancy had been more challenging than her previous 3, both mother and child emerged healthy and strong, much to the relief of everyone involved, particularly Abel, whose old fears about childbirth complications, rooted in Sarah's fatal experience, never fully faded despite the successful births of their previous children. "I think this shall be our last," Grace said to Abel as she held their newborn daughter, exhaustion evident in her voice but happiness shining in her eyes nonetheless. "4 children feels like a complete family, does it not?" "More than complete," Abel agreed, gazing down at his wife and youngest daughter with an expression of profound contentment. "More than I ever dared hope for after Sarah and Daniel died. I thought myself destined for a life of solitude and quiet grief. Instead, look at what we have built together." Indeed, by 1890, the combined Pritchard Malone Ranch had become one of the most successful and respected operations in the entire valley, known not just for the quality of their cattle, but for the fair and honest way Abel and Grace conducted their business dealings, treating their hired hands with respect and paying fair wages even during years when other ranchers might have taken advantage of desperate workers seeking employment. Their eldest son, Thomas Daniel, now 10 years old, had already begun learning the practical aspects of ranch management from his father, showing an aptitude for the work that suggested he might one day take over the operation himself. Their daughter Sarah Grace, 8 years old, had inherited her mother's head for numbers and her father's patience with animals, often found in the barn caring for sick calves or helping her mother with the ranch's accounts. William, now 5 years old, remained the most rambunctious of the children, constantly testing boundaries and seeking adventure, much to his parents' simultaneous exasperation and delight. And baby Elizabeth, still too young to show much of her developing personality, was doted upon by her older siblings, particularly Sarah Grace, who took her role as older sister quite seriously. The town of Cedar Hollow had also continued to grow and prosper throughout the 1880s, and by 1890, it boasted not just the schoolhouse and churches but a proper hotel, several successful businesses along its main street, and even a small hospital staffed by a doctor who had come west from Chicago seeking opportunity in the growing frontier community. This medical facility, ironically, might have saved Thomas Pritchard's life had it existed a decade earlier, a fact that Grace acknowledged with bittersweet gratitude whenever she considered how different her life might have been had such resources been available during that fateful autumn of 1878. "I sometimes wonder," she confided to Abel one evening as they watched their children play in the yard, "what would have happened if Thomas had lived? If that fever had not taken him and our daughter, would we have ever met in the way we did? Would I have found this happiness with you?" "I have wondered similar things about Sarah," Abel admitted. "It is a strange thing to be grateful for the life we have built together while simultaneously mourning the losses that made this life possible." "I do not think there is any easy answer to such wondering, Grace. We can only be grateful for what we have now, while honoring what came before." "You are right, of course," Grace said, leaning against his shoulder as the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "I think Thomas would be glad to know I found happiness again, even if the circumstances that led to it were born from tragedy. And I believe Sarah would feel the same about you." "I believe so too," Abel agreed. "We honor them best, I think, by living fully, by loving completely, by raising our children to understand that grief and joy can coexist. That loss does not have to mean the end of happiness, only its transformation into something new." As the decade turned and the 1890s progressed, Grace and Abel's family continued to thrive. Thomas Daniel grew into a capable young man who, at 18, began taking on increasing responsibility for the ranch's operations, showing every sign of following in his father's footsteps as a respected rancher in his own right. Sarah Grace, at 16, had developed into a young woman known throughout the valley for both her business acumen and her kind heart, often assisting her mother with charitable efforts to help newer settlers in the area establish themselves. Having heard countless times the story of how her own mother had struggled after Thomas Pritchard's death before finding help and eventually love with Abel Malone. The story of Grace Pritchard and Abel Malone had, by this point, become something of local legend in Cedar Hollow, told and retold by those who had witnessed their courtship unfold in real time, a testament to the possibility of finding love and healing even after devastating loss. Young couples in the valley, facing their own struggles with grief or hardship, often sought out Grace and Abel for advice, and the couple never hesitated to share their story, believing that their experience might offer hope to others walking similar difficult paths. "We tell people," Grace explained to a young widow who had recently moved to Cedar Hollow and sought out her counsel after losing her husband to a ranching accident, "that grief is not something to be rushed through or ashamed of, but neither is it something that must define the rest of your life. I stood exactly where you are standing now, believing my capacity for love and happiness had died along with my husband and unborn daughter. I was wrong, so very wrong." "But how did you know," the young widow asked, tears in her eyes, "that it was not too soon, that you were not somehow betraying your husband's memory by allowing yourself to love again?" "I do not think there is ever a perfect timeline for such things," Grace replied gently. "Some people take years to open their hearts again, others find comfort more quickly. What matters is not the timeline, but the sincerity of what you feel, and the respect you continue to show for what came before." Abel and I never asked each other to forget our first spouses. We simply made room in our hearts for new love alongside the old grief. That is the only advice I can offer you, though I know it may take time before you feel ready to hear it. This pattern of offering comfort and guidance to others who had experienced similar losses became something of an unofficial calling for both Grace and Abel as the years progressed, their own healing having equipped them with a particular wisdom about navigating grief and finding renewed hope for happiness. They never charged for this counsel, believing it a natural extension of the kindness that had been shown to them during their own darkest days. In 1895, tragedy struck the valley in the form of a severe drought that threatened to devastate the cattle industry that had sustained Cedar Hollow for decades. Many ranchers faced the prospect of losing everything they had built, their herds dying from lack of water and grazing land, their financial futures crumbling before their eyes. Grace and Abel, having built substantial savings through years of careful management, found themselves in a position to help their neighbors weather this crisis, extending loans at fair rates to struggling ranchers and sharing water resources from their own well-managed land. "We could have simply protected our own interests," Abel told his eldest son Thomas Daniel, now 23 and increasingly involved in major decisions about the ranch's operations. "But I remember too well what it felt like to face crisis alone, without help. Your mother taught me, in a way, through her own experience after your namesake's death, that community support can make the difference between survival and ruin." This spirit of generosity during the drought crisis further cemented the Malone family's reputation throughout the valley, and by the time the drought finally broke in 1896 with a series of much-needed spring rains, Cedar Hollow's ranching community had weathered the crisis with remarkably few losses, a testament to the cooperative spirit that Grace and Abel had helped foster throughout their years of leadership within the community. Grace's own mother, having lived to the impressive age of 78, finally passed away peacefully in 1897, having spent her final years living with Grace and Abel's family after the difficulties of maintaining her own household in Laramie became too much for her advancing age. She had lived long enough to see all 4 of her grandchildren grow into young adults, and had expressed, in her final days, profound gratitude for the happiness her daughter had found with Abel Malone. "I worried so much for you," she told Grace during one of their final conversations, "after Thomas died, after you lost that sweet baby girl. I feared you would never recover, would spend the rest of your life shrouded in grief. Instead, look at what you built. Look at this beautiful family, this successful ranch, this life filled with love and purpose. I could not have asked for anything more for you, my dear daughter." Grace held her mother's hand during those final days, grateful that she had lived long enough to witness this transformation, this journey from devastating loss to profound happiness, and grateful too that Abel had been beside her throughout, offering support during this new grief just as he had during her original loss so many years before. By the turn of the century, in 1900, Grace Pritchard Malone and Abel Malone had been married for over 2 decades, their partnership having weathered droughts, the natural passing of elderly parents, the challenges of raising 4 children to adulthood, and countless smaller struggles that come with life on the frontier. Their eldest son, Thomas Daniel, now 20 years old, had taken a wife of his own, a young woman named Charlotte who had moved to Cedar Hollow from Denver, and the couple had recently welcomed their first child, making Grace and Abel grandparents for the first time. "I never imagined," Grace said to Abel as they held their infant granddaughter together, marveling at this new generation beginning its own journey, "that I would live to see this. Grandchildren, Abel, our own grandchildren carrying forward everything we built together." "Nor did I imagine it," Abel agreed, his gray-blue eyes, now touched with the first signs of age around their corners, shining with unmistakable joy. "When Sarah and Daniel died, I thought my capacity for such joy had died with them. You taught me otherwise, Grace. You taught me that love, once thought lost forever, can find new expression, new depth, new life." Sarah Grace, their second child, had by this time become a respected schoolteacher in Cedar Hollow, having pursued education specifically so she could help other children in the valley receive the kind of learning opportunities that had shaped her own understanding of the world. She had married a young doctor who had moved to the area to help staff the growing hospital, and the couple had settled in town, though they visited the ranch frequently, maintaining close family bonds despite Sarah Grace's shift toward town life rather than ranching. William, now 15 years old, remained on the ranch, showing increasing skill and interest in the cattle business, seemingly destined to eventually take over significant portions of the ranch's operations alongside his older brother Thomas Daniel. And young Elizabeth, now 10 years old, had inherited her mother's love of learning and her father's patient way with animals, showing particular interest in the veterinary aspects of ranch life, often accompanying local veterinarians on their rounds and asking endless questions about animal care and treatment. As Grace stood on the porch of the ranch house one evening in the autumn of 1900, watching the sun set over mountains that had witnessed so much of her life story, she found herself thinking back to that terrible day in 1878 when she had stood in the Cedar Hollow Cemetery, grieving her husband and unborn daughter, and had told a stranger that he could never understand loss like hers. Abel joined her on the porch, wrapping his arm around her shoulders in the familiar gesture that had comforted her through more than 2 decades of shared life. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sensing her contemplative mood. "I was thinking about that first day," Grace said, "in the cemetery. About how wrong I was and how patient you were with my wrongness." "You were not wrong to think your grief was singular," Abel said gently. "Every loss is its own particular sorrow, shaped by the specific love that preceded it, but you were wrong to think that meant no one could understand or share in that sorrow with you. I have thought, over the years, about what might have happened if you had not come to speak with me that day," Grace continued. "If the women of the town had not sent you to offer comfort. Would I have found my way to happiness eventually, do you think? Or would I have remained locked in that grief forever?" Abel considered this question seriously, as he considered most things Grace asked him, with careful thought rather than quick dismissal. "I do not know," he said finally. "Perhaps you would have found happiness with another in another way. Perhaps you would have remained alone, focused entirely on the ranch and never finding room for romantic love again. I cannot know what might have been. I only know what did happen, and I am profoundly grateful for it every single day." "As am I," Grace said, turning to look up at her husband's weathered face, so familiar to her now after 22 years of marriage, yet still capable of making her heart flutter with the same affection she had felt on that snowy night when he had rescued her from the blizzard and confessed his growing feelings for her. "I told you that you could never understand loss like mine, and you proved me wrong not by arguing, but by simply being present, by sharing your own understanding without demanding I acknowledge it immediately. You taught me, Abel Malone, that shared grief can become the foundation for the deepest kind of love." "And you taught me," Abel replied, "that even a heart broken as thoroughly as mine had been could learn to love again, could learn to hope again, could learn to build a future rather than simply endure the past." They stood together on that porch as darkness fell fully across the valley, their children's voices carrying from inside the house, where Elizabeth was reading, allowed to entertain her visiting older siblings and their families. The sounds of laughter and conversation creating a symphony of familial happiness that neither Grace nor Abel could have imagined possible during their darkest days of grief so many years before. The ranch they had built together, both literally and metaphorically, stood as a testament to the possibility of renewal after devastating loss, to the particular kind of understanding that could bloom between two people who had walked similar paths through grief and emerged, together, into a shared future filled with love, purpose, and profound happiness. In the years that followed, Grace and Abel continued to watch their family grow and prosper. Thomas Daniel and Charlotte welcomed 2 more children, giving Grace and Abel 3 grandchildren from their eldest son alone. Sarah Grace and her doctor husband had 2 children as well, both of whom showed early interest in medicine, seemingly destined to follow in their father's professional footsteps. William, upon reaching adulthood, married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, and the combined resources of both families created an even more substantial ranching operation that continued to prosper well into the new century. Elizabeth, the youngest, pursued her interest in veterinary medicine, eventually becoming one of the first female veterinarians in the entire territory, treating not just livestock, but also the growing number of horses and other animals throughout the valley. Her services in high demand precisely because of the gentle, patient approach she had learned from watching her father work with animals throughout her childhood. Grace and Abel themselves, as they aged together, never lost the particular tenderness that had characterized their relationship from its earliest days. They continued to visit the small cemetery on the hill regularly, tending not just to the graves of Thomas Pritchard and the infant daughter Grace had lost, but also traveling occasionally to tend to Sarah and Daniel Malone's graves at a small plot Abel maintained on a quiet corner of their combined ranch land, having moved their remains there years before so he could visit more easily and teach his children about the family members who had come before them. "I think," Grace said to Abel one final time, as they sat together in their later years, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played, "that we honored them well. Thomas and Sarah, and our two babies who never had the chance to grow. We honored them not by remaining locked in grief, but by living fully, by loving completely, by building something beautiful from the ashes of what we lost." "I believe that with my whole heart," Abel agreed, his hand finding hers in the familiar gesture that had comforted them both through more than 3 decades of shared life by that point. "You told me once that I would never understand loss like yours, and in the strictest sense, perhaps that was true. My loss was my own, shaped by my love for Sarah and Daniel, just as your loss was shaped by your love for Thomas and your daughter. But in understanding my own particular grief so completely, I found I could recognize the shape of yours, could offer comfort not from theoretical sympathy but from lived experience. That recognition, that shared understanding, became the foundation for everything we built together." "And what we built," Grace said, watching their grandchildren's laughter fill the golden autumn air, "was worth every moment of the grief that preceded it. Not because the grief was good or necessary or something to be grateful for in itself, but because we chose, both of us, to let that grief transform into something new rather than remain trapped in its shadow forever." As the sun set on another day in their long, happy marriage, Grace Pritchard Malone and Abel Malone sat together on the porch of the ranch house they had built into one of the most successful and respected operations in the entire Wyoming Valley, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of love and resilience that had defined their extraordinary partnership. What had begun with words of anger and grief in a cemetery on a cold autumn day in 1878 had blossomed, over more than 3 decades, into a love story that the entire community of Cedar Hollow had watched unfold with admiration and hope, a testament to the possibility of finding profound happiness even after the most devastating losses, and a reminder that sometimes the person who understands our grief most completely is the one destined to become our greatest love. Their story, told and retold throughout the valley for generations to come, became a local legend, cited by countless couples who found themselves facing similar journeys through grief toward renewed hope and love. The Malone Ranch itself, expanded and improved through the decades by their children and grandchildren, stood as a physical monument to their success, its prosperity a direct result of the partnership Grace and Abel had built through mutual understanding, respect, and an unwillingness to let past tragedy prevent future happiness. And on quiet evenings, when the wind carried the scent of prairie grass and cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures beyond, Grace would sometimes think back to that moment in the cemetery when she had told a grieving widower that he could never understand loss like hers, only to discover that his understanding, born from his own profound grief, would become the very foundation upon which they built a lifetime of shared happiness, proving that sometimes the deepest connections are forged not despite our wounds, but through the very act of recognizing and honoring them in another. Their love, tested by loss and tempered by grief, had grown only stronger with each passing year, a testament to resilience of the human heart and its capacity to find joy again, even after the darkest of winters had seemed to promise only endless cold.